Okay, so let's talk a little bit about sample collection. So one of the things when we first started doing these workshops is we were using the terminology whole effluent toxicity, so it's wet testing, and it's now used a lot in ambient monitoring, just for the regular health of the environment type monitoring, stormwater monitoring, non-point source stuff. We use it for all different kinds of ambient situations at Granite Canyon. It's still used for monitoring discharges, point source discharges, like end of the pipe kind of stuff from sewage treatment plants, industrial operations, oil refineries, things like that. But we use it a lot for like agricultural monitoring. We work on a lot of agricultural programs at Granite Canyon. We do a lot of work with the Department of Pesticide Regulation. So we're always mucking around in sites like this that are systems that are receiving tailwater runoff from farms. And then stormwater monitoring, same situation. Any time that there's like a big flush of water through a system, whether it's an ag field or a parking lot, you could be mobilizing contaminants to the environment, and looking at the effects of those contaminants in the receiving system is going to give you some indication as to their impact on the community, the populations in the community in that receiving system. So there's a variety of settings we can go to. Those are more like settings that would be considered toxic. We also go directly to receiving systems, things like lagoons or estuaries. We have harbor. Here is San Diego Bay. I believe this is the Sacramento River. This photo is great because it sort of demonstrates potential influence from agricultural on one side and urban on the other. Urban has a huge impact on the receiving systems, much more so than in most situations than agriculture. So throughout today and tomorrow, I'll talk about samples. And when I'm referring to a sample, it can mean effluent stormwater or receiving water, and it's just whatever it was that we collected. So it's not always going to be an effluent, even though the titles of a lot of these documents have whole effluent toxicity in them. They're used for a variety of applications, and so I'm trying to get away from just calling something an effluent every single time. As I mentioned before, we can test these as a single sample or with multiple concentrations. Stormwater and ambient samples, things that are collected typically for programs like SWAMP, are usually just tested at 100% and not diluted. This is a single grab sample versus like an automatic sampler at a sewage treatment plant that's going to collect a composite of the effluent over, say, 24 hours. We'll collect like 100 milliliters of the effluent, every hour or so, and keep it chilled in a nice box. So some of the tests that we do, if you think about us bringing a sample back to the lab, we have, according to EPA, 36 hours to start the test. SWAMP gives you an extra 12 hours to start the test. Usually we bring back a bottle of water and we get the thing going. With effluent sampling, if you have a known source of water that you can just go back and collect from that effluent stream whenever you want, a lot of tests incorporate 3 separate samples that are used throughout the course of the 7-day test, depicted by 1 bottle versus 3 bottles. Again, when you're working with these 3-bottle tests, these longer-term tests, we usually dilute the sample to different concentrations and compare it to the control. Ambient tests, generally just a single concentration compared to the control. I don't use the term treatment very often, but a specific concentration of the samples in the documentations usually referred to as a treatment. And it has a minimum number of replicates, the test chambers that the organisms are in. For example, the chronic fish test, this is the longer term fish test that measures growth. You have to have at least 4 jars of sample, 4 beakers, 4 bowls, 4 whatever it is required. And it also has a certain number of organisms that need to be in that treatment, and for fish it has to be 10. Sample collection. So usually for effluent sampling, and so when I say effluent, I'm usually referring to something like a sewage treatment plant or a manufacturing plant, produced water from a refinery, a point source, something that has to be specified in a permit. There's usually a single place in a plant where the effluent is collected. There's usually some sort of composite sampler that collects that sample. So you're getting sort of a little dip of that water every 30 or 60 minutes for 24 hours, usually in a refrigerated setting to keep the sample fresh. For the environmental samples, we're usually interested in knowing exactly where it came from, so we GPS the environmental samples. All the SWRCB database is full of GPS waypoints for exactly where the samples came from. This is some of our spot sediment collection. Similar concept, except we're collecting the mud from a receiving system instead of the water from a receiving system. Here's a grab sample going on in a fairly pristine receiving system. This is one of our reference sites for a program we did a few years back. And we're collecting just single grabs of the sample, so it's sort of more of a snapshot than the composite sampling. And then a situation like this is more like a research situation. This is a spiked irrigation experiment that was done a few years back. And so this is sort of a precarious sampling pose right here, collecting a sample from some spiked irrigation water running through a ditch. So what's important and unifies all of these samples is recording the time and the procedure on a chain of custody form, so that there's a record of that sample being collected, exactly when and where it was collected, and what it's going to have done with it. We're going to talk more about COCs in the QA part of it, and we'll talk more about record keeping too in the QA part. I mentioned earlier, we're not allowed to hold the sample for very long. Toxicity has one of the shortest holding times. Within the EPA protocols, there's a maximum holding time of 36 hours for first use of the sample. And so this is something that's important to, it's one of the most easy to violate quality assurance steps within a toxicity report. We're going to talk more about reviewing toxicity reports tomorrow. And we'll talk a lot about holding time. Within SWRCB, SWRCB has a 48-hour holding time. It's program specific. So we get an extra 12 hours, mostly for logistical reasons. On days that you're, on tests that you're collecting 3 samples, sample collections usually on days 1, 3, and 5 of the test, and each sample is used for 2 days within that protocol.